When he said those words, something inside me cracked. "You'll never change," Mark said, leaning back on the couch with that smug little smirk I hated so much. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched my mug of coffee. It wasn't just the words. It was the weight behind them. The years of quiet judgment and constant disappointment wrapped up in 5 simple words. I stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for even a hint of softness, of regret. But there was none. Just that look like he'd already decided my life, my choices, my worth. "Never change," he said again, softer this time, almost as if he were savoring the finality of it. "This is who you are, Emily, and I can't. I just can't deal with it anymore." I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something across the room. But instead, I did the only thing I could. I put my coffee down and walked out. The sky was gray that morning, the kind of cold, overcast morning that seemed to echo every word he had ever said to me. I walked to the edge of our backyard, hands shoved in my coat pockets, and just stared at the fence separating us from the quiet street. I could hear the faint hum of cars passing by, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Everything felt muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath. For years, I had tried to be the wife he wanted, the woman he expected. I cooked, cleaned, smiled when he smiled, nodded when he lectured, laughed at his stupid jokes even when they weren't funny. I poured my energy, my time, my heart into a relationship that left me empty, hollowed out, always chasing a version of myself that I wasn't sure even existed anymore. And yet, in that moment, staring at the gray sky and listening to the silence of the neighborhood, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I was done, not with him, well, maybe him too, but done with letting someone define my worth. Done with the endless cycle of trying and failing to meet impossible standards. Done with the whispering self-doubt that had taken root so deeply it had started to feel like me. I had no plan, no grand idea of what to do next. I just knew I had to move, had to act, had to somehow take control of the story of my life. And that meant starting with me. The first step, I decided, was small. Ridiculously small. I stopped smiling when he made that smug little joke. I stopped agreeing when he criticized. I started speaking my mind even if it trembled, even if it scared me. That morning, as I walked back inside, I refused to apologize for my silence. I refused to let his words slide over me like they had for years. He noticed, of course. Mark always notices. "What's gotten into you?" he asked later that day, frowning as I poured myself another cup of coffee, this time without offering him one. I just shrugged. "Nothing," I said, but even I could hear the firmness in my voice. The first crack of steel forming in the Emily he thought he knew. Days passed, weeks, and I started to see things differently. I started remembering who I was before all the never-changed judgments, before the constant feeling that my life had to revolve around someone else's approval. I enrolled in a photography class one had been talking about for years but never dared to take. I started running again, feeling the sharp rush of wind on my face and the burn in my lungs like I was reclaiming pieces of myself I had forgotten existed. Mark noticed. He always notices. But instead of admiration, I could see confusion, frustration, a subtle edge of fear. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt me. In fact, it made me feel powerful, alive, dangerous even. Not in a scary way, but in the way that comes from realizing you've been asleep for years and have just woken up. One evening, as I framed a photo I had taken of the city skyline at sunset, Mark leaned against the doorway and said, "You're different." His voice was softer now, uncertain. And I smiled. A real smile this time. One that had nothing to do with him, with his approval, or with his smirks. "Yeah," I said. "I guess I am." That night, lying in bed, I thought about all the years I had wasted, years of trying to meet a standard that wasn't even mine, of shrinking myself to fit into a mold that was never going to hold. And I promised myself, quietly like a secret chant, that this was only the beginning. He might have said I'd never change, but he didn't know the fire he had just lit. He didn't know the storm he had just unleashed. Because change wasn't going to happen slowly. It wasn't going to be subtle. It was going to be overwhelming, life-shaking, soul-igniting. And by the time he realized it, it would be too late. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet. I only knew one thing: the Emily he thought he knew, the submissive, quiet, endlessly accommodating Emily was gone. And the new Emily? She was only getting started. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things I had denied myself. Photography, art, even friendships I had neglected. Things I had brushed aside because I had been too busy being good enough for someone who didn't deserve me. And suddenly, the possibilities seemed endless. I whispered my plan to the darkness, to the empty room, to myself. I'll show him. I'll show him exactly what he's lost. I'll show him that I can change, and not for him but for me. And with that thought, for the first time in years, I slept with a quiet, satisfied smile on my face. Because something had shifted. Something had awakened. And Emily, the one he thought he'd never change, was finally ready to rise. I never realized how much of myself I had given away until I started taking it back. It was in the little things at first: the way I laughed without holding it back. The way I dressed for myself instead of for his approval. The way I refused to tiptoe around his moods. Each small act felt like a rebellion, a declaration that I belonged to me now, not to him. Photography became my sanctuary. I signed up for a weekend class at a studio downtown. Something I had dreamed of for years but always dismissed because we couldn't afford it. Or you don't have time. I didn't care anymore. I didn't even ask. I just went. Walking into that studio for the first time, camera in hand, I felt a rush of electricity I hadn't felt in ages. It was like stepping into a world where I was allowed to be exactly who I was. And no one could tell me otherwise. I met other people there. Passionate, creative, alive in a way I had almost forgotten existed. There was Sarah, a freelance journalist with a sharp wit and a smile that made everyone feel seen. And Jamal, a soft-spoken painter who painted the city streets as if he could capture its soul on canvas. They welcomed me immediately. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the warmth of genuine connection. Meanwhile, Mark. He was quiet, suspicious, as if he sensed the shift in the air around me. He didn't say much at first, just small comments that hinted at his discomfort. "You're out a lot these days," he said one evening as I returned home from class. My hands still smelling faintly of coffee and paint. I smiled, calmly, not giving him the reaction he craved. "I have a class, Mark, that's all." He frowned, shifting on the couch like he didn't quite know what to do with a wife who no longer fit into the mold he had carved for her. I caught him watching me sometimes, eyes narrowing. But it wasn't the anger I had expected, it was confusion. And that confusion thrilled me more than I thought possible. I started exercising again. Running in the park before the city woke, feeling the wind whip against my face. The burn in my legs reminding me that I was alive. That I could push my body, my mind, and my spirit to places I had forgotten. I bought new clothes, not extravagant or flashy, just things that made me feel confident, strong, and beautiful in my own skin. For the first time, I looked in the mirror and smiled at the woman staring back. She was real. She was unstoppable. Mark's words echoed in my mind often, "You'll never change." How ironic. Now that I was changing in ways he couldn't even begin to recognize. And I realized something crucial. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about me. About reclaiming the life I had put on hold for a man who never truly appreciated me. One Friday evening, after a long week of classes and early morning runs, I came home to find Mark sitting in the living room scrolling on his phone. I smiled faintly, carrying a bag of groceries, and he looked up. "You're different," he said, almost under his breath, like he was admitting a secret he didn't want anyone to hear. "Yes," I said softly, setting the groceries down and walking past him. "I am." He didn't press further, but I could see the gears turning in his head. The Mark I knew, the confident, controlling man, was being quietly unsettled. And it was intoxicating. That night, I stayed up late in the kitchen, editing photos I had taken that day, the golden light hitting a brick wall just right. A pigeon landing on a fire escape, the city breathing in the morning haze. Every click of the shutter, every edit I made, felt like a small act of defiance. This was my world now. My eyes, my perspective, my vision. The following week, I met an older woman in my class, Victoria, who had been working in photography for decades. She took one look at my work and smiled, a knowing, approving smile. "You've got a talent," she said. "Raw, but undeniable. Keep pushing it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words felt like fuel to a fire I hadn't even realized was smoldering inside me. I began dedicating more hours to my craft, staying late in the studio, editing photos, experimenting with light, composition, and angles. I even started posting some of my work online, receiving small bursts of encouragement from strangers, people who had no idea about my personal life or the battles I had fought in silence. And then came the first ripple in my marriage that I hadn't expected. Mark began to notice things, not just the new confidence in my walk, or the subtle sparkle in my eyes, but the subtle independence I was cultivating. He would comment on my camera, on my photos, sometimes casually, sometimes with a hint of unease. "That's pretty good," he said one evening. I simply nodded, smiling inside at the way he struggled to place this new version of me. At work, I started speaking up more, voicing ideas I had once kept hidden. My colleagues noticed a change too. I could feel the respect slowly replacing the polite tolerance I had been used to. Every compliment, every nod of approval was a small victory. A reminder that I was no longer invisible, and yet, amidst all of this, the true power of my change wasn't just in the things I did, it was in the subtle psychological shift that Mark couldn't control. He had spent years assuming he knew me, shaping me into someone he could manage, someone he could mold. But I was no longer his project. I was a force he couldn't contain, a life he hadn't signed up to understand. The first time I saw real fear flicker in his eyes, it was small. A glance, a pause in his speech, a hesitation before he tried to assert control. But I noticed. I always noticed. And with every flicker, my confidence grew, my smile widened, and my resolve strengthened. I knew one thing for certain, this was only the beginning. Mark had underestimated me for the last time. And the Emily he thought he knew, the quiet, accommodating, invisible wife, was gone forever. I was rising. And when the full force of my transformation hit him, it would be too late. It was the little things at first. A lingering glance, a laugh that didn't belong to him. A story from my day that didn't need his approval. Mark noticed everything, of course he couldn't help it. And I loved it. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Well, maybe a little, but mostly because I was finally taking up space in my own life. Unapologetic ally. One evening, after another photography class, I walked in to find him lounging on the couch, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. I had stayed late to edit a set of photos I was particularly proud of, a series capturing the city. Just as dusk melted into night, I leaned against the doorway, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You're out late again," he said, his tone that mix of curiosity and irritation I had grown to anticipate. "Yeah," I replied lightly. "We had a guest speaker tonight. She's a professional photographer, Victoria, remember? She's amazing. Showed me techniques I never even knew existed." Mark's eyes flicked up, a tiny crease forming between his brows. He didn't ask more, but I caught the twitch in his jaw. Something about me being out, learning, growing, it unnerved him. I set my bag down and began unpacking groceries, humming softly to myself. For the first time in years, I felt a steady confidence I could almost touch. I was no longer the wife who waited for his validation. I was the Emily I had been before I let his judgments define me, and stronger than ever. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle shifts in Mark's behavior. He became quieter, more hesitant in his commands, almost as if he were questioning whether I would obey or if I even could be tamed. He started asking questions about my photography, sometimes casually, sometimes with genuine curiosity. But there was an edge now, a flicker of discomfort I could see clearly. It was intoxicating to watch. I remember one particular evening vividly. I had returned from a weekend photo walk downtown, capturing the glow of streetlights reflecting on wet pavement. I stepped into the house with my camera slung over my shoulder, my backpack heavy with equipment. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine. But he looked up at me differently. A subtle shift in his posture, a hesitation in his words. "You really seem into this," he said finally, his tone betraying both surprise and unease. "I am," I replied, setting my camera down and taking a deep breath. "It's something I've always wanted to do, Mark, and I'm finally doing it." He nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. "It's good," I smiled, a soft, knowing smile. Not malicious, not triumphant, just calm, measured confidence. That smile became my quiet weapon. Every time I caught him off guard, hesitating, uncertain, I felt the power shift ever so slightly toward me. It wasn't about winning arguments or shouting over him anymore. It was the subtle psychology of control, me, steady and present in my own life. Unshaken by his critiques, by his opinions, by the years he had tried to dominate me. The change in me wasn't only external. It was in how I carried myself, how I spoke, how I moved through the world. I started asserting boundaries I had never dared to enforce before. When he criticized me for something trivial, I would pause, then calmly state my perspective. When he tried to control my schedule, I politely but firmly refused. At first, he pushed back. But he quickly realized resistance wasn't going to lead to the old submissive Emily. I began keeping a journal, chronicling every moment, every realization, every small victory. It became a record of my awakening, a tangible reminder of how far I had come and how far I could still go. Reading back, I could almost see the invisible cage I had been living in, the walls slowly crumbling as I gained clarity and strength. One night, I went out for dinner with friends from my photography class. Something I never would have done before without asking him first. The restaurant was cozy, warm, buzzing with chatter and laughter. I felt alive, radiant even as I spoke freely, laughed heartily, and shared stories about my latest shoots. For the first time, I realized how isolated I had been. How much of my life had been measured by his approval rather than my own desires. When I returned home, Mark was sitting in the living room, arms crossed, pretending to watch a game on TV but clearly distracted. I could feel his eyes on me, scanning every detail: my hair, my posture. The faint glow of excitement that lingered around me like sunlight. "You seem different," he said, voice low. "Yes," I replied simply. "I am." I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to justify. The words alone carried weight, and I could see the flicker of panic behind his eyes. He realized he didn't recognize me anymore, and that realization thrilled me. I started taking risks outside the home too. I signed up for exhibitions, submitted photos to local galleries, even began networking with professionals in the city. Every small success fed my confidence, and every acknowledgement of my talent reminded me that my worth was independent of him. At home, Mark's control slipped further. He tried subtle manipulations, casual jabs, quiet criticisms, but they bounced off me now. I responded calmly, thoughtfully, sometimes with humor, sometimes with silence. And each time, I felt the balance tip a little more in my favor. By now, I was no longer just Emily, the wife who could never change. I was Emily, the woman who was discovering herself, reclaiming her identity, and silently teaching him that underestimating me had been his biggest mistake. One night, I stood by the window, camera in hand, looking out over the city skyline. The lights reflected in the glass like thousands of tiny possibilities. I whispered to myself, a quiet vow: this is only the beginning. He hasn't seen anything yet. I'm just getting started. And with that, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The Emily who had cried in silence, who had cowered under his words, who had felt invisible and trapped, she was gone. And in her place stood someone unstoppable, quietly orchestrating a slow, inevitable awakening, not just for herself, but for the man who thought he could define her life. Mark didn't know it yet, but the game had changed. And the rules were mine. It was the first time I truly felt the power of my own independence. I had been building it quietly, subtly, letting it grow like a hidden fire while Mark remained blissfully unaware, or at least, he thought he was. But the moment it became visible, tangible, something in the air shifted. One Saturday morning, I woke up early, the sunlight spilling into our bedroom, painting the walls gold. I went for my run like I always did, feeling the cold wind against my face, the steady rhythm of my heartbeat reminding me that I was alive, capable, unstoppable. When I returned, Mark was still in bed, scrolling through his phone, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he were holding back words. "You're really changing, huh?" he said finally, not angry but unsettled. I paused in the doorway, letting the question linger like smoke. "Yes," I said calmly, shrugging into my jacket. "I'm finally becoming the me I've always wanted to be." He didn't respond, just watched uneasily as I moved around the house with a quiet confidence that had begun to unsettle him. Over the next few days, I started taking more deliberate steps. I began attending gallery openings, networking events, and professional meetups for photographers, sometimes dragging friends along, sometimes going alone. I dressed sharply, confidently, in ways I had never dared before. And each compliment I received, especially the subtle ones from men and women who had no idea about my personal life, was a spark that fueled my growing sense of self. Mark noticed. Oh, he noticed. At first, he tried to make light of it. "You're out late again," he said, with that same casual tone he always used to try to mask control. But the tension behind his eyes betrayed him. He was watching me, analyzing me, like a man realizing he had lost his map to a place he thought he controlled. I began inviting him less to my outings, not in a malicious way, but simply because I didn't need him anymore. I had my own life now, my own passions, my own people. And with each step I took away from the version of life he had imposed, I could feel his unease grow. One evening, I came home from a small gallery showing, carrying a portfolio under my arm. Mark was on the couch, pretending to read, but his attention was on me. "You really have been busy," he said, almost accusingly. "Yes," I replied, setting the portfolio down and running a hand through my hair. "I've been building something." For me, he opened his mouth, probably to make a snide comment, but stopped. I could see the thought in his eyes, something like, "Who is she now?" And it thrilled me. It wasn't just about making him notice me, it was about making him feel the absence of control he had always taken for granted. He had underestimated me for years, assumed I would stay small, quiet, and malleable. And now, watching me step into my own power, I could see the cracks forming in the foundation of his arrogance. I started documenting my progress, meticulously, photos, notes, ideas, even financial plans for my own future. I was building something tangible, something he could not take away. And with every small success, every acknowledgement from someone outside our marriage, I felt my confidence blossom. One particularly memorable evening, I was invited to a private showing by a well-known local photographer. The event was buzzing with creative energy, filled with people who were passionate, excited, and inspiring. I mingled, shared my work, and received genuine admiration. And then, I caught myself smiling quietly, realizing Mark didn't belong here. His opinions didn't matter here. He couldn't touch this part of my life, and he would never fully understand it when I returned home. He was waiting, pretending to be casual, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. "Looks like you had a good time," he said, voice tight. "I did," I replied, placing my coat down and letting the moment linger. "It was amazing. I met people who actually understand what I do and who encouraged me to grow," it felt real. He said nothing after that, just a quiet grunt. A feeble attempt to reclaim control that I now held in abundance. And for the first time, I realized that true revenge didn't need confrontation, yelling, or drama. It could be subtle, psychological, inevitable. And that's exactly what I was creating. I began noticing other subtle signs of his discomfort. He would question his own words before speaking to me, pause as if unsure whether I would comply, hesitate in ways that were new, unfamiliar. He was realizing slowly that I was no longer the woman who had once bent to his will without question. And each pause, each moment of uncertainty in him was a small triumph I savored quietly. At home, I started taking more control in everyday decisions. Dinner plans, weekend activities, even small household purchases. Decisions I once deferred to him I now made decisively, confidently. He grumbled occasionally, but he didn't resist in the same way anymore. I was no longer operating in his shadow. He was starting to feel it, and the unease was deliciously apparent. Then came the first real test. Mark tried to belittle one of my photography projects, a series one had worked on for weeks. "I don't know why anyone would care about this," he said dismissively, sipping his beer. I froze for half a second, memories of old arguments flickering through my mind. Then I smiled calmly, a soft, controlled smile. "You don't have to care, Mark. I'm doing this for me. And judging by the response I've gotten, plenty of other people do." I watched his jaw tighten, the frustration brewing silently behind his eyes. He had no comeback. He had nothing. And in that moment, I felt the sweet, intoxicating taste of psychological victory. By now, my transformation wasn't subtle anymore, it was undeniable. Mark couldn't ignore it, couldn't control it, couldn't diminish it, and the realization was starting to eat at him in quiet, psychological ways I could see clearly. That night, lying in bed, I whispered to myself, a quiet vow: I am unstoppable. I am rising. And he will realize, too late, that underestimating me was his biggest mistake. The Emily he thought he knew was gone. And the Emily he didn't recognize? She was just getting started. The city lights had never felt brighter, never more alive. I had begun to see my life not as a series of compromises, but as an open canvas, waiting for me to paint it with bold, unapologetic strokes. Photography had become more than a hobby, it was my lifeline, my identity. My declaration that I existed for me, not for anyone else. Mark noticed it immediately. He couldn't help it. Every evening I returned from a gallery opening, a networking event, or a photography meetup, I could feel his eyes lingering longer than necessary. A mixture of curiosity, frustration, and something else, jealousy. He would ask casual questions about my day, my projects, the people I met. But I could hear the uncertainty behind every word. He didn't know how to respond to a wife who had finally stopped shrinking herself to fit into his expectations. One night, after a particularly successful exhibit, I came home with a framed photo I had sold to a local collector. The house smelled faintly of dinner he had made, well, technically reheated, but I barely noticed. My mind was buzzing with ideas for future projects, collaborations, and exhibitions. I set the frame on the mantel and glanced at him. "You sold that?" he said, disbelief thick in his voice. "Yes," I replied calmly. "And I have a meeting next week with another gallery that's interested in a series I'm working on." He sat back, trying to mask his surprise, but I could see it in the way his eyes widened slightly, in the way he shifted in his chair. He had never imagined I could do this, that I could succeed without his approval, without his input, without his validation. For the first time, I realized that my revenge wasn't just about showing him I could change, it was about showing him he had underestimated me for years. He had built his life around the assumption that I would always be small, predictable, and under his control. And now, as I stepped into my own light, that illusion was shattering before him. I started hosting small gatherings at our home, inviting friends from the art community, people who inspired me, people who pushed me to be better. Mark's presence at these gatherings was noticeable but not dominant. He tried to make small talk, to assert control, but it was clear he was out of place, uncomfortable. Watching him fumble in my world, seeing him unsure of his place, brought a subtle, quiet satisfaction I hadn't expected. The next day, I received an email from a regional art magazine requesting an interview. My work had caught someone's attention, and suddenly, my small, Quiet efforts were turning into something bigger, more visible. I felt a rush of validation, not from Mark, not from anyone in my personal life, but from the world I had finally allowed myself to join. Mark tried, of course, to belittle it. "It's just a magazine feature," he said one evening, trying to downplay my achievement. "It's not that big of a deal," I smiled softly, letting the words hang in the air. "Maybe not to you, Mark, but to me, it's everything," and it was. Every small recognition, every nod of approval from someone who saw my talent, built a fortress of confidence around me that no one, not even him, could penetrate. Then came the first real confrontation. One Friday night, after a long week of meetings and photo shoots, I walked into the living room to find Mark sitting rigidly on the couch, his jaw tight. "You're changing," he said, almost like a confession. "Yes," I replied, calm and measured. "I am." His eyes narrowed. "I don't even know who you are anymore." And that exactly was the point. "I'm the person I was always meant to be," I said quietly, deliberately, letting my words sink in. "The person you never gave me the chance to be. The person you thought would never exist." He was silent, and I could see the weight of realization pressing on him. He had underestimated me for years, and now he was watching the consequences unfold in real time. Over the next few weeks, the tension at home grew. Mark's frustration was palpable. Small arguments escalated, subtle digs became sharper, and I found myself observing him, noting the cracks in his composure. It wasn't malicious, it was justice in its quietest form. The slow unraveling of the man who had thought he could define me. One evening, I went out to a professional photography mixer, leaving Mark behind at home. I arrived at the venue, heart pounding with excitement, greeted by people who were genuinely interested in my work. The energy was electric, the conversation stimulating. I realized I had been living in a bubble, one defined by Mark's expectations, and now I was breathing fresh air, vibrant and intoxicating. When I returned home, Mark was waiting, attempting casual conversation. But I could see the tension behind his forced smile. He was trying to reclaim a sense of authority, of control. But it was slipping further and further from his grasp. I didn't engage in arguments or fight. I simply existed fully, confidently, and he couldn't ignore it. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how far I had come. My life outside him was flourishing. My creativity, my independence, my confidence, they were unstoppable. Mark could see it, feel it, but he couldn't stop it. And that, I realized, was the true victory. Revenge wasn't about tearing him down or humiliating him publicly. It was about building myself up so fully, so unapologetically, that he couldn't help but notice and regret the way he had treated me. For the first time, I felt free. For the first time, I felt truly alive. And for the first time, I knew that the Emily he had thought he knew, the quiet, compliant wife, was gone forever. It was a crisp autumn evening when I realized just how far I had come. The city skyline glittered like scattered diamonds, and I stood on my apartment balcony, camera slung over my shoulder, heart racing, not from fear or anxiety, but from pure exhilaration. I had built a life that was mine, a self I no longer needed to shrink for anyone, especially not Mark. Our relationship had changed drastically over the last months. He was quieter, tense, often lost in thought when I was around. The once confident man who had dismissed me as someone who would never change now seemed unsure, unmoored, and powerless to affect the woman I had become. That night, I decided it was time to confront the last remnants of my old life, not with anger, but with presence, with certainty, with undeniable success. I drove over to our shared home, carrying a portfolio of my latest work, my mind clear and focused. Mark was waiting when I walked in, his face a mixture of curiosity, fear, and that old, stubborn pride. "You're different," he said, almost too quietly to hear. "Yes," I said softly, stepping into the room with deliberate confidence. "And this is just the beginning." I laid my portfolio on the dining table. Each photograph captured a piece of the city, moments of raw emotion, light and shadow, life in motion. They were vibrant, powerful, alive, just like me. I could see his eyes scanning the images, his expression a mixture of awe and discomfort. He didn't know how to react. "Emily, they're good," he said finally, trying to sound casual, but the words faltered. "They're mine," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I created them for me. Not for you. Not for anyone else. For me." I could see the realization hit him in waves, subtle and unrelenting. This wasn't the same woman he had married, the woman he thought he could control or define. She was gone, and in her place was someone unstoppable, unapologetic, free. I smiled, softly, almost kindly, though a spark of triumph lingered. "You said I'd never change," I reminded him, voice calm but piercing. "Well, Mark, look at me now." He swallowed hard, the weight of regret heavy in his expression. The man who had spent years trying to shape me, to define me, to limit me, had lost. Not to someone else, not to circumstance, but to the woman I had always been beneath the surface. The woman he had ignored, dismissed, underestimated. I spent that evening sharing my work with him. But it wasn't about approval or praise. It was about showing him, in the most undeniable way, that I was no longer constrained by his opinions or his expectations. I had built something real, powerful, and beautiful, and he had no claim to it. In the following weeks, I continued to rise. My photography gained recognition, invitations to exhibits increased, and I built friendships and connections that nourished me in ways I had never experienced before. Every small success reminded me that my life was mine, that my value wasn't tied to anyone else's perception, especially not Mark's. At home, Mark's attempts to regain influence grew more desperate but subtle. A casual remark here, a pointed comment there, but I no longer reacted the way I used to. I listened, acknowledged, and moved on. My calmness, my unwavering confidence, became the most effective form of revenge. He realized, finally, that he couldn't control me, manipulate me, or diminish me anymore. And it frustrated him in ways I didn't even have to provoke. It happened simply because I existed fully. One night, he asked me to sit with him, quietly, without accusation, without judgment. "I don't know what happened," he said, voice low and weary. "I thought I knew you. I thought I had control, and now, you're different. I don't know how to reach you anymore." I took his hand gently but firmly. "Mark, I didn't change for you. I changed for me. All those years of trying to be someone I wasn't, that was for you. And look where it got us." He didn't respond immediately. He just stared at me, the weight of understanding settling like a stone in his chest. And in that silence, I felt the quiet triumph of every step I had taken, every boundary I had enforced, every moment I had spent reclaiming myself. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, almost reluctantly. Even if it's hard to admit, I smiled, the victory sweet but tempered with compassion. "Thank you. But this isn't about pride, Mark. It's about respect. Respect for who I am, for who I've always been. And it's time we both acknowledge that." From that night forward, the dynamic between us shifted completely. I wasn't submissive. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't waiting for his approval or validation. I was Emily, fully realized, fully alive, and fully untouchable by the limitations he had once tried to impose. And Mark, he had no choice but to recognize it, to see me as I was, strong, independent, brilliant, and uncontainable. And while he struggled with his own regret and the realization that he had underestimated me for years, I felt nothing but peace. Revenge had never been about making him suffer. It had been about claiming my life, my identity, my voice. And in doing so, I had not only changed myself, but I had exposed the fragility of his assumptions and arrogance. I stood on my balcony that night, city lights glittering beneath me, the wind cool against my skin. And I whispered to the woman I had become, "You did it. You changed. Not for him. Not for anyone, for you. And nothing will ever take that away." The Emily he thought he knew was gone. The Emily I had created, the Emily who was strong, confident, independent, and unbreakable, was here to stay. And she would never look back.